Hello and welcome to this short lecture for GCSE English on Shelley and Byron. I'm Dr. Clara Dawson. I'm a lecturer in 19th century literature at the University of Manchester. And I'm going to talk about two short poems today by Byron and Shelley. But what I'd like to focus in on today is the use of rhyme in these poems, and that might be something you haven't done in depth on the GCSE syllabus. So I want to look at how poets are using rhyme to amplify the ideas that they're talking about in their poems. So I thought I would start with a quotation that I really like from a critic on poetry. So I'm just going to read that out. And he writes that rhyme imposes upon the logical pattern of expressed argument a kind of fixative counter pattern of alogical implication. So if we break that down, what he's saying here is that there are two patterns that we might find within poetry. One is the logical pattern of expressed argument, and what he really means by that is just quite simply the words that we use, the order or syntax of the sentence, simply the meaning of the words that we say. And that's something that when we first read a poem, we usually try to work out what its meaning is, and that can often be quite complicated. But then he writes about this counter pattern in poetry of alogical implication. And what he's referring to here are the kinds of visual and oral patterns of the poem on the page and in the ear. So more specifically, we might think of the rhythm of a poem, of its meter, but also the way that rhyme creates a sound pattern when we read it out loud, but it also creates a visual link on the page. And he describes this as alogical because it's something that operates unconsciously as well as consciously. So when we hear particular sounds, for example, like a fast or a slow rhythm, we will interpret that to have a particular emotional resonance or meaning. And the same with rhyme. Our brain starts to create patterns when these words begin to sound similar. So hopefully that will make a little bit more sense when we actually turn to the poems themselves. So I wanted to start with Percy Shelley's sonnet, Ozymandias. And this is a poem that those of you who have studied will know is about a traveller who describes a ruin in the desert. I've always imagined it in my head as being a kind of a sphinx or kind of pyramid-like scene where he sees a ruined statue this sort of writing of this statue that declares, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair." And the poem is very much thinking about power and the legacies of power. So, of course, this was a king who at one point had great power, but now is just a ruin in the desert. And it plays into themes that Shelley's very interested in exploring across his career, to do with freedom, democracy, tyranny and leadership. But I want to think about the ways in which reading the rhyme of the poem helps us to a deeper understanding of the meaning and the themes and the ideas of the poem. So initially, if we think about the rhyme scheme of a sonnet, and I've just on this Word document noted the rhyme. That's something, if you've not seen that before, we note the rhyme through letters to show which words rhyme. And you'll see the first four lines have an A-B structure. That's a regular rhyme scheme. And the last four lines, E-F, E-F. So that seems like, regular. That's what we would expect from a sonnet. But the middle six lines of the poem are a bit disrupted. So A, C, D, C, E, D. That's a bit messy. It's not the kind of strict rhyme scheme that we would associate with the sonnet. So that's just a first instance in the way that I think this broken up rhyme in the middle of the sonnet actually mirrors the broken up statue itself. So we can see this is one way that poets use rhyme to perform the image that they are creating. So I think that's something that when we hear it, we start off with regular, we feel like, oh, something's a little bit disrupted here, and then it returns to a kind of regularity at the end. And as I go through these rhymes, hopefully we'll see why Shelley would use these disruptions here. So if we think about the first rhyme scheme, so the letter A, so that tends to be, this is the strong rhyme that opens the poem. And the words that rhyme are land, sand, and command. So these are words that they have a strong consonant sound, they're monosyllabic, land and sand are. So they're quite firm. And I think what they do is they build up a kind of positive affirmation. So this is an image of great power, this vast statue that someone has built to commemorate themselves. So we have also the internal rhyme in the third line, so stand and sand. So we use the term internal rhyme for words that aren't at the end of the line, but within the line. And I think that just emphasizes, in a way, the power and force, stand and sand. So if we think about the patterning of language, we have this positive, strong force. I think, to me, this is counterbalanced by the rhyme of stone and frown. So that's what we call an off-rhyme. They almost rhyme, but they don't quite rhyme. So it sounds a little bit off. So I think what Shelley's doing here is he's telling us, right, this is someone who's trying to kind of promote their immortal power. But we start to sense that something is wrong. The language gives us a sense almost of a kind of the instability of the shifting sands beneath this. Then we move to the middle of the poem, and this is where we get this great statement of power. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. And I think we're often told to read that as ironically, because we now know that the statue is in ruins. But I want to think particularly about how the rhyme works to deflate this statement of power. So kings rhymes with lifeless things, and you can see that the rhymes are quite far apart. So there's a sense of that's a kind of a weaker rhyme than the kind of regular rhymes that we get in the first four lines. But I think that also that association of kings, which the King of Kings, of course, a very powerful image, with lifeless things, obviously creates an association that this is now just a thing, kind of a thing, of course, not being a very grand term there. I think the way in which this is a command, so he's telling people looking at the statue, look on my works and despair. But if we kind of look at the that sort of rhyming with bear, the bear sounds that this now exists in, we can see that it turns from a command into a kind of reality of the despair of the statue itself. So we can see that sort of that strong, commanding rhymes in the first 4 or 5 lines of the poem is deflated and disrupted by the rhyme of despair and bear, and also appear, I think, there as well. I think we can see that there's a kind of or here, in fact, that there's an off rhyme of appear and despair. So they should almost rhyme, but they don't quite. So that sense of a kind of appearance versus reality, again, something that is just a little bit off key there. And I think when we finally get to the end of the poem and the full rhyme that we finish with of the kind of despair, bear, decay, away. And I think it's significant that Shelley chooses to end on the agency of the sands. So the force which is committing action in this final lines is not the king, it's not the traveller, it's not even the poet, it's not the sculptor. It's the sands. So these are the things which are performing the action of stretching far away. Boundless is a very Shelleyan word. It's something that we see throughout his poetry. It's, I think, something that's associated both with freedom, but also a kind of despair in a sense as well. It's something that's always an ambivalent word for him. But I think that the kind of strength and force of this poem, it's the kind of full harmony of those rhymes of decay and away, give the ultimate force in this poem to the natural world itself. And I think that's something that really solidifies the way in which the poem wants to think through the futility of human power, the futility of tyranny itself. So hopefully that kind of shows us how rhyme could be used by a poet to amplify ideas. And I'm going to move now to Byron's poem, When We Two Parted. And I gather this is, you were thinking about this poem in terms of love and desire. And I'm not sure how you've done it in class. I think when I was reading the poem, I very much wanted to interrogate the gender politics of this poem. And it's interesting, I think, that Byron doesn't give us pronouns. So when we read it, I was questioning, who is, reading it as a kind of presumably heterosexual poem, and thinking, well, who is the man and who is the woman here? It's written by Byron, so we'd probably more likely assume that it would be a man speaking, but we don't know that for sure. Obviously, poets write in different voices. I did think ultimately it was a male voice writing about being left by his lover. And I just wanted to think about some of the kind of power dynamics that go on here. Ultimately, I read it as being quite an egotistical poem, a poem that is quite scathing, I think, about kind of a woman who has shown her own agency and power in leaving this man. And so I wanted just to think about, if we look specifically at the rhyme, how might that help us kind of read the poem, or sort of read the story in a way? And I think, do we see this as a voice that's sad? Do we see that it's a voice that's angry or accusing? And that, of course, plays in, I think, to the kind of gender politics. And I wanted to think particularly about how rhyme might build a form of cause and effect. So this sound patterning almost builds up a kind of unconscious cause and effect. And I think particularly with that first verse, and I realized you could tell the entire story of the poem if you just look at the rhymes. If you just had those words: parted, tears, broken-hearted, years, cold kiss, foretold this. Like we'd know what that story was there. And I think what we see is that the kind of the parted has caused the broken-hearted. So that follows on in a kind of logical sense. The tears and years are very much, that he wants to show that this is something that's gone on for a long time. So that sort of heightening of the tears through the years is maybe a bid to create sympathy. The woman is seen as cold, so her cold kiss is the cause. So it's the cold that foretold this sorrow. So I think the kind of patterning here of the sound very much throws an accusation towards this woman. She is the cause of this suffering, not him. If we move to the second stanza, and I think the rhyming here of brow and now, so again, he wants to emphasize the length of time that he suffered. And I think that the reference to the brow speaks to the physical experience of the body. Of course, we do tend to experience pain of rejection through our bodies. But it's linking to now, I think, gives us that sense that this kind of pain is something that's ever present. The next four lines, I think, are particularly revealing in terms of the gender politics. So this is a period where women could be very much condemned for their fickleness, but also for any form of promiscuity. And I think, the vows are all broken. The reference here to fame. So fame could be like you could have fame because you're a poet or an artist, but your fame could also just be your reputation in terms of gossip. And that idea of I hear thy name spoken and share in its shame. So this is a period, if any of you have recently watched Bridgerton on Netflix, you will know this, that reputation really matters. And to be gossiped about or spoken, to have your name spoken, is almost in itself a form of shame. To me, the speaker here is actually playing on the shame in order to further condemn this woman and present him as the victim. I think here that association through rhyme of fame and shame, it solidifies the sense that, this woman who, maybe she's been promiscuous. I think that's one of the subtexts of the poem. To me, it sort of deepens her shame, that he's almost trying to kind of drag her down by associating the rhyme in this way. The next stanza, I think, is interesting in terms of pronouns. So what we see as being the key rhyming words here are me, thee, thee. And I think that's significant because we see, rather than a kind of me, thee, where perhaps two lovers would be interwoven, we see their separation almost as if they're running on parallel lines. To me, it seems significant that the me comes first. It's quite an emphatic emphasis on the me. I think that's where a moment perhaps of the poem's egotism, the exploration of itself. It's like they name thee, but before me. So the me is the important pronoun here in this poem. We could possibly read a sense of threat into these lines, long shall I rue thee, too deeply to tell. So there's almost, by raising this question of telling this woman's secrets. Is there a sense of threat here? I don't know, I might leave that up to you to decide. In the final stanza, I think again we see this cause and effect through rhyme. So we get, in silence I grieve, that thy heart could forget, thy spirit deceive. But again, we see the kind of, his grieving is caused by her deceiving. So those are kind of intimately connected through sound, the sound of the rhyme, as well as through the meaning. And we end again with that rhyme on years and tears. You'll remember from the first stanza, we should flip back up to that, we have tears and years. Here we have years and tears. And I think just that reversal, it almost shows how wrapped up the speaker is, that this is almost something like, whatever way he looks, he can't get out of this binding association. So I think, again, it's, to me, what the rhyme of this poem tells us. I think it reveals an egotism on the part of the speaker. I think it reveals quite kind of a thread of misogyny to the kind of gender politics, to the audacity of this woman who decided to leave, perhaps to pursue other men, I think is the implication. But also I think it's used to present himself as a victim, to throw any cause onto the woman rather than to him. And of course we don't know, I mean, the poem doesn't reveal to us why this separation happened. So in some ways, I think the rhyme kind of deepens the almost the sort of slight creepiness to this poem that perhaps on a surface level we might read as a sort of innocuous or innocent poem about the sadness of parting, but these threads of anger and misogyny, I think, are running under the surface. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you for listening, and I hope that's given you some tools to think about rhyme in other poems as well. It's something that when I first turn to a poem, I tend to mark up the rhyme. That could be quite useful if you were doing a sort of practical criticism or looking at on-scene poetry. It's one way of thinking about the patterns of the poem. So I'll finish there for now. Thank you.